today for our final webinar on Let's Talk About Interpreting, which is the roundtable discussion. Before I present again our guest speakers, I would like to correct a wrong that I did last time. I totally forgot under the pressure, and I shouldn't have, under the pressure of time, to thank our interpreters, our language interpreters, Eleni Athanassatou and Maria Xanthopoulou, who have volunteered their knowledge, their skills, and their time in order to provide interpretation from English into Greek for all those of you who are listening to us and that have switched to the Greek channel to take part of this in this discussion by relying on our interpreters. Thank you very, very much. And to the language interpreters, now today we have to add our sign language interpreter, Anna Yaku, who is going to ensure that hard of hearing people have equal access to a very important discussion pertaining to interpretation, to interpreting services that are essential to their well-being, their existence, and their equal footing in our societies, in modern societies. Now, today, we have the pleasure of having in our roundtable Έλενα Τσαρσιταλίδη, who is a professional sign language interpreter and has joined us here today in her capacity as Secretary General of the Association for Sign Language Interpreters of Greece. She has studied primary education at the University of Patras, and she is a professional sign language interpreter since 2013. She's also a member of the European Forum of Sign Language Interpreters, and she has been working for the Association of Deaf People of Greece since 2015. Unfortunately, our speaker, Hárης Γκίνος, professional interpreter, is currently interpreting for the European Parliament, where important discussions, if I'm not mistaken, about vaccination, COVID-19 vaccination, are taking place, among other things. So he won't be able to join us. However, we are still very, very fortunate to have the director of SKIC-A interpretation of the General Directory for Interpretation of the European Commission, Alexandra Panagacou, who made an amazing presentation 2 weeks ago. So it's a pleasure and an honor to have you, along with Stéphanos Vlachopoulos, a professor at the Ionian University, the School of Translation and Interpreting of the Ionian University, who is a specialist in interlingual communication in multicultural environments. Foteinή Αποστόλου, also an associate professor in the English department, Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Thessaloniki, specializing in translation, interpretation, and intercultural studies, is here to discuss with us all the important questions that were going to be raised, have been raised by our participants during the previous rounds. And we also have the pleasure of having Dr. Isabel de Souza, an expert for over 30 years in professional and training and education of interpreters and intercultural communication. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. And I would like also to inform our participants that they have to use the Q&A box to enter their questions, comments, so that they will be taken into consideration and will be also added into the equation of today's discussion. Now, let's start right away, if that's okay with you. If you're ready, ladies and gentlemen, there's only one gentleman around here, ladies and gentlemen, so here we go. I have tried to group all the comments and questions that have been raised through the previous weeks. And I tried to categorize them by theme. And the first theme that came, the topic that came over and over again, that was brought up over and over again, was interpreters education and training. So, and this pertains to conference interpreting, to community interpreting, and sign language interpreting. The first comment, and this is addressed to, I believe, Stéphanos and Fotini primarily, or Fotini and Stéphanos primarily, is how is it possible that NGOs have usurped community interpreters training in Greece? What happened?
Should I start?
Yes, of course you should.
Thank you for inviting us in this panel, and it's very nice to participate again and deal with the questions from the audience, and I saw that there are a number of them. Yes. Now, that's an interesting question. It's not easy to answer it, but I can say that this flow of immigrants that came in the country, started coming in the country, found the academic community unprepared, I think. I don't think there were people who were focusing the research or teaching on community interpreting. That started sometime later. So the academic community was definitely unprepared. The universities and the schools were unprepared for that. And even today, I think there are very few of us who do research or teach community interpreting at a university level. So it's very difficult to introduce studies in community interpreting at a higher level. That's why the NGOs found this gap, this deficit, and managed to usurp this training. But I think we are in a much better position now to introduce community interpreting in universities at a BA level, maybe through specific courses or lifelong learning programs, certification programs. We'll see how it develops, but I'm sure, and there are a few of us now who are in a position to do that, and I'm sure we will, in the short term, be able to introduce community interpreting. I don't know if we're going to have the support of the state. I find it highly unlikely because, as Stéphanos said, we have made efforts to communicate with the state authorities, with the competent ministries, but to no avail. So unfortunately, if we do something, we'll have to do it on our own. And I don't know what level of certification we'll be able to give, given the fact that the state will not acknowledge that.
Thank you very much, Fotini. Thank you very much. Stéphanos, do you have something to add on this?
Thank you very much. I think Fotini said it all. I mean, it's actually the big problem is the state. The state doesn't recognize the need. It doesn't see the need, actually. So if the state establishes the framework, everything will come into place, I think. But as long as it doesn't do that, the whole system will not come together. Exactly, this is why the NGOs, they actually took the place of the state. They were there when the state was absent, and is still absent in that way. There's no regulation for, I would like to call it public service interpreting, to move away a little bit from community interpreting, since it has gained a peculiar connotation, and it some kind in the mind of the people, it is considered to be something not very professional. So yes, I think the state is absent, and this is why the NGOs took its place. But it's never too late. I think the stakeholders should come together, try to engage in a dialogue with the state. It's not easy. It's not easy. I'm not an expert in politics. I don't know much about politics. try to talk to the state and try to get some order into the whole system.
So in a way, you answer the question, what are we to do to ensure things change? In addition to what Fotini said, making sure that community interpreting training comes into play in the university.
Yes, to change. I've been following a little bit the discussion about the reorganization of the Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and some of these things, if I consider them to be show us the direction, they're a little bit disappointing at the moment for what I would imagine, or at least for what I have shown in my vision last week. So it's a little bit poor at the moment, the payment, the organization, the accreditation. But we have to work together as the stakeholders. It's very important, and by this I mean the politicians. We have to find politicians, and of course the associations. All of the associations have to work together with academia. I think Fotini will be happy to help. I will be happy to help, and other people in this area would be very happy to help.
I'm sure there are lots of people that can pitch in and actually help and contribute into shaping something. Alexandra wants to take the floor. Alexandra, you have the floor.
Effie, can I speak in Greek?
The problem is that we do not have interpretation into English. If that's okay for you to speak in English.
Fine. Yeah, sure. Okay, so thank you very much for the replies I heard already. I'm not a specialist, as you understand, but if I may say, as an interested professional, let's say, okay. So for me, it is important to take into consideration as regards community interpreting that the people who, let's say the practitioners, are usually or are often people who do not have the academic qualifications to enter a university course or a postgraduate course, etc. So I think there, the academia has to be a bit more, how can I say, inventive about how the possibility for training can be given to people who do not have the formal qualifications for access to training. I think this is an important element. The professional associations should see that, and also the academia. Thank you.
You're so right about this. And I can see Fotini nodding her head in approval. Do you want to add something, Fotini? Because maybe I could give the floor to Isabel, because Isabel can give us the North American perspective, because North Americans have in the US and Canada or Australia, they have been gone through these several decades back. So they have they have an advanced learning knowledge on this. Isabel, would you like to add to this?
Yes, I'm just, I want to be sure I understand, because am I hearing correctly that the comment was that some community interpreters don't have enough training to get to an academic program? I'm not sure I understood it well. An academic program just requires a high school degree.
Yeah, but Isabel, yes, I said that. We often see people who finally do community interpreting and do not even have the high school degree.
Well, I think we have to be careful, because the number of languages that cover all interpreting other than conference interpreting is much vaster than conference interpreting tends to gravitate towards, you know, the 10 top languages and others, but the training is typically within a smaller frame of languages. I think we have to be careful not to generalize community interpreting, and that's why I have such a hard time with that term as well, because community interpreting has come to mean interpreters in the community, which aren't always professional. Interpreting, specialized interpreting, is a whole different ballgame. And while you have languages for which it will be very difficult to find specialized interpreters who are qualified, that only makes it more challenging, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. What has happened in the US and in many other countries is that the rates being paid, the NGOs that are offering the training are not choosing to train professionals. those professionals that speak Vietnamese or Somali or other languages, they're doing other things. They're not going to work in a profession that is paying so low and that is not giving them jobs, it's just giving them freelance work. So I think there's a disconnect when we start categorizing interpreters by the people in the market. And I'll give you an example. Many companies in the US and abroad are purposely hiring bilinguals from the community versus hiring professionals because they can get away with it and because they can promise them a career and train them only to pay them paraprofessional levels. Now, certified interpreters are questioning these practices and saying, why are you marketing to bilinguals who aren't interpreters versus marketing to the professionals who have been trained and certified? And the reason is because they can pay them a lower rate. So there's there's an issue of categorizing interpreters by those that are being marketed. And those, there are individuals in many languages that can be trained and that do have high school degrees. And so it's a bit, it's not really the case in most countries. The court systems have had the need for interpreters for decades. Immigration is nothing new. It's just that with public service interpreting, there are always new languages coming in. So while you may have, professional interpreters in certain languages, most associations, most hospitals, most court systems are not looking ahead. If they hear that there's going to be an influx of people from a certain country for which they haven't had, they need to start preparing and training interpreters. They can't do it after they arrive. So what happens is when they have an influx of a new population, they're just grabbing people from that community to provide the service. So I think it's really, we have to look at the ISO standards for all interpreters, and the standards have to be high. And if certain languages can't meet those standards, then they can't meet those standards. But we can't lower the standards because certain languages don't have interpreters or individuals who, have high school degrees. I think it's a disservice to our own profession if we do that, because I remember in the US when people would say, oh, interpreters can't afford a workshop. Then when 40-hour programs were created, people would say, oh, the interpreters can't do 40 hours, because they were thinking of the recently arrived immigrants, poor individuals, and they were really generalizing community interpreting as if they were the immigrants themselves. And the reality is that now we have university programs, we have bachelor programs, we have master's programs. So it's really a question of perception.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I agree with you with so many points. I know that Stéphanos wants to say something.
Yes, we don't, I would like to disengage again from the term community interpreting. I don't like the term. I would like to speak about public service interpreting. And I think we do have trained people to work in the public services in certain languages. It's not all the languages, of course. It's not the lesser spoken languages, the immigrant languages, but we do have interpreters trained in English and French, which can work as lingua francas and which can do can help ease the situation, ease the pressure on the public services, because also the public services themselves suffer from a lack of interpreters. It's not only the people in need. And of course, there's a lack of training for the people who are acting, are working as interpreters, are used as interpreters, which again, I hate using the term interpreters for people who don't have a training, for people mediating in any way. But yes, of course, training can be provided in any way. You can work people, you can help people climb up the ladder. As I said last time, I believe in a register. if we have a register, everything will fall into the thing will fall into one part, the pieces, and you will have the top interpreters, and at the bottom you will have the people who just are bilingual, and you can use them in whenever there is nobody in the top tiers available. Isabel mentioned that I think it was in the States, I think she said, you can use the cheapest personnel available, the lowest trained, for example. For example, there are other countries where you can't do that. And I have in mind the Norwegian register for public service interpreters, which is managed by IMDI, which is the immigration department, and which has a register. I think it's a 4-tier register. And at the top level, you have people who work both at public services, but also go to conferences. And they are paid very well. This is why they bother and do get into the register. But you do have also tier 1 with people in rare languages who are there to help whenever there's nobody available from the bottom, from the top tiers. The state or any agency, public agency that needs an interpreter is obliged to move top down by law when it has to find an interpreter. So if you get the register, you can manage a lot. And of course, yes, you can get training. And I don't remember, I think Fotini said it, there are many, you can find many ways to train interpreters. But let's find them first a place to work. Let's first help them become visible, because today we do not know who is interpreting in Greece. We do not know.
You're absolutely right, Stephanos. Vasiliki, would you like to add to this?
Yes, so I think I couldn't agree more with what Stephanos just said. This is why PEM has been advocating for years now for a national register of, you want to call it official interpreters, for an official register of interpreters and translators with tiers that can be exactly as Stephanos said, and to address the issue, because we need also to be realistic. And the reality in Greece is we don't have in a lot of languages, for example, as in the States, second, third generation immigrants in the rare languages who speak enough Greek to be in an academic program and so on and so forth. And there are needs that arise that you can't anticipate. Yes, you can foresee a lower, a more flexible, let's just say, some more flexible criteria for rare languages with less qualifications, and foresee also a system of facilitating the access of these people to language education and interpreting education, and also install, this was part of our proposal, and also have a specific time frame that says, yes, we can accept you at the lowest tier with lower qualifications because there is a need, but you can only stay there for so many years, and at the end of these years, you need to have at least that to be able to stay on the register. And here is where we need the role of the state once again, because in this case, the state has to provide the access to those people to the education they need. I cannot expect, is the state going to provide it? I will say, in my experience, not just as president of this association, but as a professional who has dealt with more, I think, all governments in Greece since 1994, when I first started. Probably, are they going to help? Probably not. Are they going to resist? Yes. We shouldn't stop. This is I can say. We have to push and we have to provide documented solutions. In my experience these past days, I think that in some cases, yeah, in some ways I am a little bit more optimistic, but because when you come and you state that this is the law, this is European law, you can do it and be in compliance, or you can continue to do what you set out to do, but not be compliant, and in this case you could be subject to a lot of problems. Unfortunately, even the staff of the ministries is not very sensitive to these issues. I was in a meeting, I will not say with which ministry, it's not a foreign affairs ministry, a few days ago. You should see the faces of the people when I told them, because they were all about the price, the price, the price, the price, lower the price, higher the price. And I said, at some point, I must admit, I got angry and I literally said, listen, we are talking about prices. We are talking about this and that and that. At some point, we need to start adding the photo of the person who is behind the price. Because every time you talk about price and every time you tell me this is too expensive, I would like to ask you to, next to this price, put the face of a person whose life, whose well-being, whose freedom depends on that price. And of the person who will come at this price.
Vasiliki, this is what you're saying is about awareness, creating public awareness. And this is a question that is following up, and we will address this question. So let's move on. And I want to kind of merge the two questions that are following up. How, to what extent can the conference interpreting paradigm in terms of education, in terms of training, can help public service interpreting? I'm going to erase community interpreting from this presentation from now on. Public service interpreting and court interpreting, as well as sign language interpreting, capitalizing on the experience from other countries, but also from the experience of actual programs on conference interpreting. How can this paradigm be introduced to court and public service interpreting, and of course, sign language interpreting? I think I will give the floor to Fotini to start with. Fotini.
Thank you. I have to add something to what was said earlier, however. A
Go
few
ahead.
things. First of all, I believe that as academics, we can't always talk about the state. The state has its own agenda. I understand it. I know at this point we're all disappointed. I'm pretty sure that it's not going to do anything about studying and about introducing certification, accreditation, whatever. So as academics, I believe we have a responsibility to do something about the training of people in PSI or in community. I love the term community interpreting. For me, it is interpreting to a certain extent within a community and for a community. Well, I don't mind both terms, as a matter of fact. I do mind intercultural mediation because I'm lost somewhere. It confuses me, and I think it's confusing for the people as well, and we have to deal with that as well. But I think we can't always talk about the state and have that as a sort of, the state doesn't do anything, we can't do anything. The state doesn't do that, we can't. It has to end at some point.
It has to end because the pressure has to come from the bottom up at some point, and not top to bottom. Yes.
And we have to offer these people
absolutely
some type of knowledge, a level of knowledge that is a high level, not the level of training that NGOs provide. Whatever the state does or does not do, and it's not going to do anything. And that's what I wanted to say.
And with respect to this question, how can the conference interpreting paradigm can help us create all the programs that, you know, Stéphanos, you and I are always dreaming of having in our universities. How can this paradigm, and I think Alexandra can also help with this, how can this paradigm can be used in order?
Yeah, I did some time ago. Alexandra doesn't know that, but I did contact Evgenia Paparouni, who is the head of the Greek language.
She was also invited, but she respectfully declined because she was very busy today.
I understand, and how busy. But I did contact her and asked her if perhaps the European Commission and the DG interpretation could be involved in such a collaboration that we had for conference interpreting, similar to what we have for conference. I would be more than willing to organize such a thing with their support, but she said that the DG interpretation is not involved in that sort of training, only conference interpreting training. So unfortunately that didn't work, so we have to do it on our own.
And let's now start with the sign language interpreters. What is their take on interpreting right now and interpreting training?
Well, hello. Thank you for having us, first of all. It's a really interesting topic, I think. For us, it's a bit different from what I hear, because when you categorize court, medical, or community, we are expected to do everything. So if you are a sign language interpreter and you work from the morning till night, you might be in a court and then go to the doctor and, you know, so on. So training for us is extremely important, I think, to expand our vocabulary and our knowledge to all those sections that really in your everyday life, you are not that expert in everything. You cannot be, I think. What we are trying to achieve, our association is trying constantly to have an academic program, like an academic training for sign language interpreters. But I find that a bit difficult. For example, I feel like we don't have the same head start as spoken languages. Sign language in Greece was officially recognized in 2017. So that takes us a step back. We are not in the same status as you might be, but we are trying and we hope to achieve European levels, I think sometime, someday, maybe. We collaborate with the European Forum of Sign Language Interpreters, and we are trying to see how things are done in Europe. And I don't know, I hope that in the future we will be able to have a specific program for interpreters, sign language interpreters inside a university, so that we can provide a more thorough and detailed education for us.
Thank you very much, Elena. Let's talk about accreditation now, because this is also a topic that came up several times. So how are we to associate formal training with accreditation and the issuing professional rights of community, PSI, public service interpreters? And how can we also draw from the experience of countries that have had a head start on this, such as Australia, US, and Canada, and how can we take this experience and of accreditation and professional recognition, professional rights, and implement it into the Greek interpreting landscape? Who would like to? Sorry, who would like to address these questions? Stephanie, maybe, because some of them relate to are in I believe are in tandem with your vision and your registry vision, and so you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Accreditation is something that in Greece is given by the state. We need the state again. everything comes down to a register to connect the people you train with the state, so that they can gain accreditation. You do have training in Greece, interpreter training, so you have people who are accredited in some kind, okay, in a kind, and who I think, if they would be paid better, they would also find their way into public service interpreting. But you would have to form the bodies, actually, to accredit people who have no training in, who had no university level training. So again, you need the state to set the rules, or perhaps better, everybody who is a stakeholder in the field together with the state, because the state alone wouldn't know where to start. About the experience drawn from conference interpreting, sign language, court and community interpreting in Australia, of course you can have a look at everything, but I think it's a little bit, you do know what interpreting is, you do know your needs, you have measured your needs, we have research done in the fields, we know what we do need in Greece. Of course we learn from other countries, experience is experience, we look at it. But since we have our data, since we know what interpreting is, I think when everything comes together, we can find a system that will work. It will take some time in Greece to get it and to make it work, but we should start. By the way, I don't think that anybody in the world has ever solved the issue of communication with people from other countries. There are so many languages. It's nobody can actually say he has ever solved this problem, but we have to move into this direction and try to cope with it. I don't know, the people who joined us last week, I showed a pie with the challenge. I don't even remember how many languages we are facing in Greece, but we can do our best to cope with this, and we can learn. But conference interpreting doesn't have to offer much. We have different issues. Interpersonal, don't forget interpersonal relations, interpersonal contact. As in sign language interpreting, for example, also people, we face people in distress. How do we handle people in distress? How do we interpret it both ways, not only into a language in PSI. There are many things that that are different from conference interpreting. But I think if they are integrated both into one course of studies at BA on MA level, people can be trained to do both. But in order to get the people to do both and to have the PSI or the community interpreting field profiting from trained people, you have to raise the fees. It comes down to that. It always comes down to that, to get the good people.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Fotini, would you like to chime in?
Thank you. I don't want to monopolize in any way. Perhaps if somebody else would like to say something. Yeah, accreditation comes from the state, but as I said, we have to make the first step. Yeah, we definitely have to work based on the experience of other countries like Australia, US and Canada, who have this long experience in the field, who have set up programs, accreditation processes, accreditation bodies. And well, I am optimistic, as I said this time, because we become more, at least in the academia, and the need is dire, I think.
Yes, and I think the question here is whether we can, the question translates into we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. The wheel has been already invented how can we use parts of the will that we can fit into our own will so that we'll make it this turnaround effectively for our own needs. And I know that Isabel can say a few things about accreditation and how, because accreditation is also not just, it's a step for professionalization. It's an important element of professionalization, and professionalization also translates into better pay, recognition, visibility, as Stefano said, which translates to better pay. So Isabel, maybe would you like to share something on this particular topic?
Yes, I would just say to be a little bit wary of relying on the state so much. It's already been said that they have their own agenda. And we see often in court interpreting that the court system typically takes over the training and the accreditation of court interpreters in many countries. And while that seems fine from one perspective, there's a conflict of interest in the employer being the one who's doing the training and the accreditation, to the point where we see in the US, for example, very similar to what I said before, that certain courts are not certifying in certain languages for years because they want to use the lower level qualification or qualifier for those that aren't certified to pay less. I would suggest there are organizations already accrediting to the ISO standards. ISO decided to create interpreting standards just a few years ago, and that has been really, I think, an amazing opportunity because of the brand recognition as a way to look at lobbying governments to utilize the ISO standards for accreditation. These are requirement standards for ISO, for general interpreting, for legal interpreting, healthcare interpreting, and now conference interpreting will be published soon. And these are certifiable. There's a company in the UK already certifying to all of these ISO standards, the ATC, and they're looking at ways, they've already certified freelancers, but they're looking at ways to create a individual certification process that is less cumbersome and less costly than your typical certification as a process. So I think, you know, the association, the universities, the interpreting community needs to figure out what they believe the standards should be, and then lobby the government to maintain those standards. And when this issue about money, it's about the horror stories. Every country has their horror stories related to court situations or medical situations or other immigrant situations where people died, people were imprisoned, and justice wasn't served or health wasn't served because of the language barrier. And that's the only way to convince governments that a certain standard needs to be in place. Now, again, the standard has to be there whether all languages will have individuals to fit the standard. It's a safety standard. It's not about who's in the market. It's about how can we provide safe communication. And that usually gets across to all these stakeholders who are making the decisions for us. But I would really suggest that the association look at perhaps becoming a certifying body for the ISO accreditation and not putting it all in the hands of the government, because the government will go to the lowest denominator for its own purposes.
True. Thank you very much, Isabel. Elena, would you like to add something to this? Is there anything that you would like to add?
Yes, I was thinking that accreditation is really, really important. What we are facing is, because sign language is linked to a disability, usually somebody thinks that they are charitable to offer an interpretation when they're not an interpreter. And we are facing that every day. And because our position is visible, we're not inside some headphones, for example, everybody can see us. This is also something that people are attracted to, and they think that they are offering something by being there and not using the proper quality of sign language. So we have a lot of people that are usurping, I don't want to use that word, but saying that they are interpreting, but not being interpreters. So I think that accreditation is extremely important because it certifies a quality in interpretation.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think Vasiliki would like to add something because she has raised her hand for quite a while now. Go ahead, Vasiliki.
Sure. Accreditation, accreditation is possible and is not very difficult in Greece for the skills we are talking about. So you have two levels. One is you have the academic education, so you have a university degree for a specific profession, skill, etc. You are okay. We are trying to convince the government that if we have a degree, you don't need to test us. We are okay. We have the degree. We can do the job. It's a bit tough, but we're getting there. Now, there's also vocational training. So vocational training in Greece is a system that exists. It is in place. There are vocational training centers that can provide accreditation, and this accreditation is awarded specific marks when you are going to ask for a post, for a job, for example, in the Greek government. There is accreditation already for intercultural mediation, and it is suitable for interpreters, lawyers, and people dealing with people from different cultural backgrounds. Now, the suggestion to universities, for example, is because a lot of the universities already have vocational training centers working side by side with the university. The National Kapodistrian University, for example, has one. You already have the vocational education body. You already have the acknowledged possibility by the state to provide vocational training qualification, and you already can connect it to specific marks in the grading scale for the positions in the public sector. I know it because I did the mediation course, and I get the top marks in jobs that are connected to jobs that are connected to different cultural backgrounds. So it is there. What you need to do basically is say, for example, someone working with refugees needs to have this profile, and I'm connecting this now to everything that we said about intercultural mediation, because imagine a conference interpreter, all their life they have worked in a booth, never talked to anyone, never seen anyone. I'm in my booth, I go out, I go to lunch, I come back, I don't talk to anyone. Can they work in a hospital setting? I don't know. I don't know if they can look at an open femoral fracture, for example, which is when your bone has been snapped in two so badly that it has cut through your muscles and is now sticking out your leg. You have the technical skills to do it. Can you actually? You are a perfect professional. You have all the technical skills. You will never do it. You will faint. So what you need to do now is get also the soft skills into the question, connect the technical skills, the soft skills to the job. You can start with an accreditation at the level of EOPEP, we call it in Greece, so, you know, the vocational education, and then, which is more easily accessible also to people with lower levels of education, and work your way there. And if we manage, we are really, I promise, I'm trying very hard, we are trying very hard to convince the government to listen to us, then we can also connect this to the different tiers of the register and say, to get in tier so-and-so, you need to have this accreditation. To get to tier so-and-so, you need to have this, and you can work your way as a professional, depending, your way up, depending on how much time and how much effort you are willing to invest.
Vasiliki, I think Alexandra is about to answer your femoral bone snap. So Alexandra, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Okay, yes, precisely. No, I just wanted to confirm simply things that have been said before. It is clear that it is not the same thing. It is not the same, how can I say, specification, specialization, being a conference interpreting and being a public service interpreter or a medical interpreter or a court interpreter. There is no, I mean, if I created this impression before, it was not at all my intention. On the contrary, I think that they require different training, they require different skills. This vocational training that you mentioned is a way to attain the different skills that are needed. And I very much agree with what Isabel said, and I think it is important to have it in mind. In Greece, for example, there is a lot of work that has been done with the ISO standards, where there are different standards for the different modes, let's say, of interpretation, different specializations, and I think they can be a way, a widely, broadly recognized way that introduces to the public domain and increases awareness about the differences, about the need to professionalize, let's say, the practitioners, and I think can be an element in the accreditation process. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I agree with you. And thank you for making the necessary link to the following. We talked about putting pressure on governments. We talked about creating awareness. How can we do this? In a few words, how can we create awareness? How can we convince the government of the importance of acknowledging the rights of non-Greek speakers, speakers of limited language proficiency? How can we do that? How can we educate the government on the one hand? How can we educate the users of interpreting services, of the importance of interpreting services throughout all the areas of interpreting, from conference to community to public service interpreting to court interpreting, you name it? How can we go beyond the typical ad hoc bilingual person who can, yes, Isabel, I will give you the floor right away. How can we go beyond this? I'm a bilingual, therefore I'm an interpreter. My parents were deaf, so I know sign language, and I do work, I do communicate with my parents, therefore I'm an interpreter. No, how can we go? How can we bypass this? How can we convince people? Isabel, you have the floor because you raised your hand first. Go ahead, my dear.
I have to answer this one because I'm such an advocate for this. I've worked in marketing and I did a lot of public service announcements related to this. So there's two audiences. There are the stakeholders that we need for policy, and then we have the actual stakeholders, which are the users of our service, or consumers as some call, or clients. So the only way to really address the importance of qualification, unfortunately, is by showcasing the disaster of unqualification. And we can see that in, even in conference interpreting, when we had that fake sign language interpreter interpreting for Barack Obama, right? We can all relate to that. It happens in all the fields. We can, the association can certainly try to get horror stories from their own interpreters when they hear about these situations, so that you can create some nice, simple ads. This is what happens when, this is the situation, this is the result, and this is what happens when you don't have, utilize or work with, I shouldn't say utilize, work with a qualified interpreter. But again, you have to define what qualified is. Is it a member of the association? Otherwise people will invent their own,
qualifications. Yes.
But the horror stories, number one. And then number two, for the other audience, PSAs, public service announcements in the languages, addressing their right to their human right. If there are certainly laws in Greece about the right to healthcare information in one's language, or just in general, patients' rights. Most countries have their patients' rights. Most countries have their justice system rights. Well, it's no different from anyone who doesn't speak English. So use those and let the user know you have a right to request an interpreter in your language. You have a human right to do that. Because a lot of times our users do not know the difference between a family member and an interpreter. even those that have worked with interpreters many times, they still don't know the difference because the interpreter hasn't stated their qualifications and has not really done an introduction. So they really don't know the difference. So I think it's important to educate both views on that.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I would like to hear Alexandra on this one, if she doesn't mind, and then I will give the floor to Stéphanos and Fotini, to Fotini and Stéphanos. I will alternate this time. Alexandra?
Yes, okay, thanks. Look, again, you know, I feel a bit from a very, if I may say, privileged environment, obviously, because from the in the environment I'm coming from, in the Commission, in the EU, let's say, institutions, there is an accreditation system on behalf of the employer, and there is a legal basis. There is Regulation 158 that says that all official languages are working languages in the EU, and the member states are entitled to have professional interpretation and the translation. So there is a legal basis there. And if I can say what I see as a way to increase this awareness as regards the state, let's say, as regards the authorities, I think the basic way I see is, of course, by using whatever legal basis you have. One, I mean, Isabel mentioned the human rights, patients' rights, etc. I think that one can lobby well with the ISO standards again, because every service, let's say public service, should aim to respecting this ISO standard. So I would advise the associations to lobby around these ISO standards. And certainly there is work that can be done also as regards court interpreting, legal interpreting. You know that there is a directive of the European Union, I do not have the number, that states clearly the right of people who participate in court proceedings to have court interpreters. And I think that associations and practitioners should use these tools that exist, especially, as I say, the legal tools like the directive. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Fotini, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Alexandra, you mentioned the directive. Unfortunately, the directive gives a minimum level of enforcement for certain things. For example, it does mention the right, which was already there in Greek law, that in criminal proceedings, there is the right of the accused to have an interpreter. If there's a witness, we must have an interpreter. But it doesn't state what sort of training that interpreter must have or the remuneration for this interpreter. So if an interpreter receives 17 euros per case, what sort of training could that person have? Okay, so the directive should be much more clear about the training level of the court interpreters and the remuneration that they should receive. Otherwise, it doesn't really make any difference, I believe. Now, about the remaining, how you educate professionals, I don't know, to be honest. It's very difficult to involve them. It's really very difficult. I remember once I was talking to a friend who was a public prosecutor, and I asked him, what do? You have a criminal case, you have a suspect or a person who is accused of a crime, and you need an interpreter who is very high skilled. What do you do there? You don't have the right person, that's definite. And he said, well, there's no problem because we ask simple questions. That's what he told me. So we definitely need training for these people. But again, here, it's I don't know, perhaps if we set up a course, some sort of course, we should contact, again, I think it's the academic community that has to take the first step, because again, if we wait for the state to get involved, I don't think it's ever going to happen. Well, the awareness, I think Isabel gave us some great ideas, and I would like to thank her for that. And we definitely need her.
Through negative publicity.
Yeah, but
So,
again, something that we miss, I think, and it's very important. We are all here together on this panel, but there is always the person for which we're talking about is absent, because we're mainly talking about minority groups here. We're talking about clients and sometimes interpreters who belong to minority communities, and they're always absent. And just a small thing that I would like to add, in a symposium that we organized some years ago about community interpreting, there was this person who had this huge experience. I think he was from Iraq, and he had this huge experience as a community interpreter. And he, at some point, asked this question, and he said, introducing the question, in the beginning they called us interpreters. Then at some point they said, no, you're not interpreters, you are cultural mediators. And I understood that, okay, because we have a cultural proximity. And then they started calling us community interpreters. So what are we? You know, they have no say in what is going on, and that's a real shame, I believe.
Fotini, if I may add, not just thank you very, very much for pointing that we're talking about stakeholders, and whole this discussion so far was about stakeholders, but there are several stakeholders. And the ones who receive services for which interpretation is done are not represented here, and we have to acknowledge this. Public service providers are not represented here. The government is not represented here. Authorities are not represented here. The academia is represented by, but it's just the academia and the professionals from the interpreting point of view. You're right. There are people missing this discussion that who would have to have their place in here. So, Stephanie, would you like to add something to this?
I would like, yeah, I would have to tell many stories. I'm not a specialist in lobbying, but in this project, in the SIGRIS project, we ran from 2015 to 17. Both first in the DD project, the Legal Interpreting Greece project, which was ran in 2012, and in the in the SIGRIS, we did some awareness raising among stakeholders and especially the government. So we spend money on that, and I think I'll tell you an experience I had from my second attempt. The first attempt, the court interpreting thing, the Ministry of Justice, they were not interested at all. In the my second attempt, a few years later, with the second project, we even drafted a law as a part of the project. We had Panagiotis Kribas and Spiros Dragomanowicz, our legal experts on this issue on the team, and we draw up together with the people in interpreting. We draw up a draft, and we went and presented it. And we even were asked to train people in the Ministry of Justice in interpreting. We did this. We did a 2-day event. I think it was in 2017. We talked to people high up in the government, police and justice. Everybody was very interested. But when it came down and when we had the discussions afterwards, aside from the panels, everybody said it could be too costly. It's better to pay the fine, because for court interpreting we might be fined. It's better to pay the fine instead of paying people more money. It will be very, very expensive. We didn't tell them any horror stories. We didn't try that. I bear that in mind, Isabel, for next time. But I could talk endlessly about this, especially the experience with the lobbying. But people always say yes when you see them, but afterwards they forget it. By the way, training the stakeholder, training the parties. It's an interesting issue. We tried to get we were asked to do that for the Ministry of Justice. Then the Minister of Justice asked us to conduct some training with the judges, with the School of Judges, but this never happened. We never got actually access to the school. We tried, we asked why not, what happened to us. We didn't get actually any answer at the time. We are doing some work now with the OAED, the Greek Manpower Organization, as I said. They asked us, it's the opposite thing. They recognized the need to use interpreters because they are facing many foreigners in Greece who need their services, and they asked us to help them with remote interpreting and to train them. I don't know what this means. It could be a very optimistic sign that something is changing. It could be. We are doing this until June, until the end of June, as a training project, a pilot project. And then we will hope, then we will see what will go on and what will happen afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanos. Now we have, I'm going to go very quickly over the cultural aspects of medical interpreting, court interpreting as well. There was a statement that was made by one of our participants in the previous session. Criminal proceedings and healthcare encounters can be life or death situation. How can professionals be distinct by linguists? And how can one influence the creation of professional registries? I think we kind of touched upon these questions already. So I'm going to go to the next one, which is more about intercultural mediation. Fotini. So there was this statement that says in Western cultures, healthcare professionals tend to communicate hard facts, what we call hard facts, to their patients by telling them the truth, so-called truth, or the blunt truth. You know, in other cultures, however, people often refrain from speaking freely about topics that may be considered taboo, such as cancer. Back in the time, we didn't say cancer in Greek, we said the bad thing, tokako. So it was sexual assault also, or death. So, and that was a question that was directly addressed to Isabel at the time. What is the role of the medical interpreter in these cases? And does he or she have to convey the information as is? Or should or can he or she smooth it out in a way to make it more culturally acceptable? That is a question that baby Isabel could answer, and the others. And I would also like to hear the perspective of the sign language interpreters on this particular one. Isabel, you have the floor.
Yes. Well, this is a common intercultural issue that happens. And in medical interpreting, there is the standard of introduction. And that's a very important standard because it basically sets the tone for the encounter, how to work with an interpreter, and also to see what the goal of the encounter is. So an interpreter who is following the international standards of practice actually would know that this situation is imminent and would have the opportunity to discuss with the provider. Well, you're going to be letting the family know with the patient about this, you know, cancer or whatever the bad news is. I would suggest that, you know, the interpreter can give suggestions to the provider on the issue that this may be a very touchy situation from a cultural perspective. Now it's up to the provider to decide how he or she will, you know, provide the information. And obviously it has to do with, it's because of a medical ethic that they have to provide the truth. So in terms of the role of the medical interpreter, the only role that the interpreter has is to align themselves with the objective of the encounter. But if they foresee, when interpreters were interviewed, across the, many countries, all of them stated that, and it's in the standards, that they alerted the provider that there might be a sensitive situation, either because the family's there or, something that the provider might not know, but only before the encounter. Once the interpreter is in the encounter, the interpreter really has to provide the information as it's given. And when I talked about reframing in a culturally acceptable way, I was talking more about forms of address and, terminology, but you can't really smooth out the truth. I mean, you may use a term that is less strong, but, if it's cancer, if there's a term that is less strong, you could use it, but you can't use a term like something bad. You would have to, uphold the fidelity of the interpretation. So I think a lot of people confuse intercultural mediation with changing things out. We still have to maintain the communication belongs to the parties involved, but interpreters do intervene before or after the communication. And it is within our roles and responsibilities to manage the dynamics of the parties. So if we foresee that there will be a dynamic situation, we should alert the provider as a team member before we go in and have this very difficult discussion. Now that requires high-level skills, and sometimes people assume interpreters can't do that, or that they shouldn't be trained in that, or they don't have time to train them on those situations. But if they just follow the standards cover all those situations. And it is our responsibility as medical interpreters to be culturally appropriate. And we cannot be culturally appropriate and culturally competent if we don't alert the provider that this could be a cultural issue. It may or may not, but again, just addressing the linguistic part and not mentioning it would not be culturally competent from the interpreter's perspective. So it's complex. It's not an easy answer, but I wouldn't take it upon myself to just assume that it would offend the family and smooth it out and change it. And because the provider needs to know exactly what is going on with the family, and the provider needs to know how to address the patient and the family in other situations as well. So that would be my long-winded answer to that question.
Isabel, I cannot agree with you enough when you, with respect to the pre-medical encounter session with the interpreter and the post, which is equally important, especially when you deal with mental health patients in mental health settings, because the post session, the briefing and the debriefing are important issues, especially if you work with patients and and you follow the patients throughout their therapeutic trajectory, and you follow them in repeated sessions one after the other. So I would like to hear Elena's perspective on this, and maybe then Fotini would like to add something.
Yes, first of all, I want to say I totally agree with everything that Isabella said. I was thinking while I was listening to that, two things. First is our role, which is we have to, by the code, say whatever the doctor is saying. So I will speak personally what I do in situations like that. I think that first of all, you have to say whatever he or she is saying, but then you have to read the room. For example, I would look at my client's face, and if I see a hint of doubt, or if I see that they could not process, maybe the terminology is hard, or if I detect that they have an issue comprehending what is being said, I would try to moderate the discussion, being more thorough and clear, so that the information is certainly proceeded by them. I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you very much, Elena. Fotini.
I don't know, Effie, perhaps you would be here, I think, the right person to say something, because you're the expert in medical interpreting at the moment, so I wouldn't like to.
Listen, I believe that Isabel and I see eye to eye with this, because smooth out information is not an acceptable way to go. This is one thing, and this applies also to other stuff that are equally difficult, such as foul language. I had a question last week with respect to the use of foul language, and if I may, without offending the audience, I had a question for my students. What if someone in a context, in medical context or court medical context, because we were working on a role play, says the word bitch, or even harder, fucking bitch? What happens? Are we to soften the insult? Are we, yes, Stefano is shaking his head, of course. Are we to soften the insult simply because we are personally offended? We are not supposed to use this type of language. What do we do? And the question was not whether we are allowed to smooth it out, but what if we don't know the exact equivalent in the target language? That was the exact, or if we don't know whether it's equally offensive. And my answer to this was, first of all, as you said, you don't necessarily read the room before the session. You try to prepare the session. So briefing is extremely important with all parties involved, without necessarily giving out information that is confidential. Debriefing is also equally important, but when you come into the session and you have to deal with issues such as fucking bitch, then of course you have to interpret what is said. And if you foresee that this can create tensions within the encounter, then maybe you slightly tone it down, but you convey still the insult, because the insult is a means of communication, and it shows through linguistic and paralinguistic elements what is going on in the person's frame of mind, and what this other person wants to communicate to people. So Alexandra, you have the floor.
No, again, I'm not far from an expert. I'll just speak as a layperson, but I'm still an interpreter. I think we all agree a basic element of interpretation is exactly like Isabel said, the communication encounter is between the participants. We are not there to shape the communication to the extent possible. We should not be naive. Obviously, we shape it because we are there and we are the intermediators. But in any case, in conference interpreting too, I think the first obligation, task of an interpreter, the first duty is to be, to try to be as close to the message, to the communication event, if we want, communication event, if we want to call it like this, as possible. And I think this is important. Obviously, culture plays a role, even in conference interpreting, it plays a role. But the idea is, of course, that you cannot betray the speaker or the listener. So
absolutely,
for me, this is very, very important.
Absolutely. Fotini, you have the floor. Go ahead. I think we all agree on this one. Go ahead.
We all agree, definitely. And what I wanted to say is that you are not there to deprive the subject of its right to speak, to be heard, and to hear what the other interlocutor is saying. It's the speaking subject that has the power here. And our job is to facilitate that speaking subject to communicate, but it's the subject. We're not the subject in the communication. I think if we are, and if we believe we are at some point, and that's my problem with the term intercultural mediator, because the limits there are very difficult to understand, and sometimes we tread really treacherous ground if the limits are not clear. That this intercultural mediator may at some point exactly deprive the speaking subject of their power to speak.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We're not the subject, but we're not the symbol conduits at the same time. And this is a discussion that we had in academia about the role of the interpreter. Stephanos, you have the floor.
Just some word. When I'm discussing this with my students, what I always say, look at the opposite of face-threatening acts, which is politeness. Politeness is very easy to convey, okay, but you have also to show how polite somebody is in his culture, his or her culture. It's the same in the opposite case. So both things have to come over.
Absolutely. And we have the negative and the positive politeness.
Yes.
Pragmatics have said that many times. Yes.
Some things are easier to say than others, but they have to be said.
They have to be said. And
conveyed. Okay.
Conveyed. And if the subject chose to convey, to say them, then we have to convey them. Very good. Now, we're reaching the end. I don't want to go beyond 8:30 here. So there was another statement that was said, putting yourself in other people's shoes. Is this statement attitude a matter of culture, or is it a matter of training? Who is to take this decision, and where one should draw the line? Who is to be held responsible in case of misunderstanding during an interpreter-mediated healthcare encounter? And what about medical errors due to poor interpreting? Can cultural misunderstandings be the reason behind interpreting errors leading to medical errors? How to avoid them? How to deal with liability issues? Who would like to take this question? Isabel?
Okay, I'll go ahead. There's quite a few questions here. So the first one about putting yourself in the other people's shoes, I don't think that's cultural or training. I think it's just a question of empathy, but it doesn't really relate to interpreting as much as interpreting requires the commitment to the relationship, to the therapeutic rapport, not to either party. So as much as professionals, we can be human and empathetic, I don't think that really, has anything to do with our work. Our work is really to uphold the communication that's going on. And who's responsible in the case of a misunderstanding? Well, again, the international standards that have been around for quite a while do talk about the importance of the interpreter ensuring understanding. Of course, we can't completely ensure understanding from either party, but we need to read and interpret not only the verbal and signed, but also the nonverbal facial expressions and other nonverbal communication. And that's where, when interpreters see a party with that puzzled look, that has to be communicated to the other party, because sometimes the other party can't read that. These are very culturally based expressions that sometimes the other party doesn't pick up on. So I think if we uphold the standards that talk about ensuring that we understand, and that means we have sometimes to intervene and ask, this is what I'm hearing, is this what you mean? So that I can interpret it correctly and then interpret it. What happens a lot is interpreters get into this conduit, technical role of interpreting, and oftentimes they don't intervene at all, and they just interpret seamlessly. And a lot of times it looks like it was a perfect interpretation, but the interpreter didn't understand some things that were stated, the provider didn't understand, and the patient didn't understand. So we have to be very careful that we're there not just to interpret back and forth, but to actually mediate communication. And communication does not happen unless there's understanding. And that's the big difference between dialogic communicative events and events where it's one directional, where we don't know and we have no control, we have no access to the other party. So most medical errors are due to poor communication. And most sentinel events, as we call them, can be traced to a communicative issue in the same language or in different languages. So yes, most of the times that we intervene as interpreters, it is to avoid a misunderstanding. It is because we can foresee that something can be misunderstood, or at least alert that we want to make sure that there is no misunderstanding, because many times the interpreter gets blamed for the misunderstanding when really it was a case of just not being careful about what one is communicating. So just interpreting, you know, back and forth doesn't always address the communication issues.
And unfortunately, there is an abundance of literature, especially with issues of medical errors due to poor interpreting, and we know that there has been the literature abundance, especially with cases from the United States, liabilities, things that ended in court and had lots of damages awarded to the victims or the families of the victims. But I would like to give the floor to Fotini and Elena if they want to chime in.
I think Isabel said it all.
Okay.
I don't want to add anything more since the time is pressing us.
Thank you very much, Fotini. Elena, a final word?
Only thing that I would like to add, maybe it's something different in sign language, is that you can really easily read your client, I think, because of all the gestures and nods and the facial expressions. So I think that maybe this is the key, the fact that we have to look each other in the eyes gives us the benefit of understanding and seeing in their eyes if they actually took the message, if they comprehended or everything that was being said. Maybe that could help. I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elena. I think we've reached the end of today's discussion. I know this is an endless topic, and we could have sat here and discuss about it hours on end. But I think the point here was to create awareness, to spread the word out, and to start to put the seeds for a broader cooperation, for creating a better landscape in public service and community interpreting and sign language interpreting in Greece. And for that, I thank all of you very, very much for today, for being here today, for going beyond the hour. I would like to thank all the participants that stayed beyond the hour and listened to us. And I sincerely hope that we contributed, that this discussion was up to your expectations, and that we will have the opportunity to have more discussions on the same topic with this amazing group of panelists. I thank you very, very much all for being here. Maybe a final word from my president before closing up today's session.
I have, to be totally honest with you, I have mixed feelings because I've been engaging in two different types of negotiations these past few days, one being the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the other being the Ministry of Justice. I will say that the Ministry of Justice side to me was a shock, and I'm not someone who is shocked easily. I saw people who were like, the coldest of the cold is, I don't care, it is too much money. They say, people die, too much money. People die, I can Google Translate. People die, I don't care. However, I was positively impressed, a little bit surprised with my experience with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I must admit, because first of all, I was very happy to discover that all colleagues from all different associations expressed literally the same views. So that's good. And I had the opportunity to confirm that, in fact, the view of PEN that when you approach someone with a documented proposal that says, this is where you're wrong, this is okay, this is not okay, but we can let it slide, this is EU legislation, you have a presidential decree that says you have adopted it, you have done nothing about it, you are, you are in a very bad, you risk a lot if you do not correct this. They're beginning to listen, so I am a little bit more optimistic. So I will keep this. I will keep talking, keep sending the memos. I will send some more right after we leave, and hopefully all together. I think this is the right moment. The government is starting to talk. People are starting to talk. I think the universities are also sharing our views, and we can join forces, join together. Now is our time, really, I think. So let's keep it up. Let's keep up the good work. I'm a bit more optimistic today than I was 2 days ago.
Thank you very much, Vasiliki. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us with this positive note. And I think Vasiliki is sharing Fotini's optimism, and Stefan is optimistic, although he has a vision. People who have visions are optimistic by definition. Okay.
Effie, thank you very much for organizing.
Thank you very much for this.
And thank you very much for inviting
we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Organizing.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, Stefanos, Fotini, Elena, Isabel. Thank you so very much, all of you. Have a pleasant evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.